The echo, she would soon learn, was not just in the hallway, but deep within her own soul, waiting to be awakened by the very person she had welcomed into her family with open arms. The stage was set for a drama far more intricate and devastating than any she could have imagined. A drama that would force her to confront not just Julia, but the unresolved specters of her own past, and the chilling realization that sometimes, the harder you run from history, the faster it catches up to you. The illusion of control of a perfect family was about to shatter, revealing the raw, uncomfortable truths that lay beneath the surface of their seemingly idyllic lives. And Carol, the woman who had vowed to be different, would find herself standing at the precipice of becoming the very thing she feared most. Her mother-in-law. Carol had always prided herself on being different, not just different from the other suburban moms who gossiped about their daughters-in-law over lukewarm lattes, but fundamentally, irrevocably different from her mother-in-law, Eleanor. The very name still sent a shiver down her spine, a phantom chill that had nothing to do with the crisp Chicago autumn air. Eleanor, with her hawk-like gaze and her perpetually pursed lips, had been a force of nature, a matriarch who ruled her family with an iron fist disguised in velvet gloves. Carol had endured years of subtle digs, unsolicited advice, and thinly veiled criticisms, all delivered with a saccharine smile that made them all the more potent. She had sworn on the day her son, Michael, was born that she would break the cycle. She would be the cool mother-in-law, the supportive one, the one who understood that her son's wife was not a rival, but an extension of the love that had brought him into the world. So, when Michael, her sweet, earnest Michael, had called her in late 2019, his voice buzzing with an excitement she hadn't heard since he'd gotten into his dream college, Carol's heart had swelled with anticipation. "Mom, I have some news," he'd stammered, and Carol had braced herself for anything from a new job offer to a sudden move across the country. "Julia and we filed the paperwork." "Paperwork?" Carol had echoed, a smile already forming on her lips. "What paperwork, honey?" "Marriage paperwork, Mom. We're getting married." The news had hit her like a gentle wave, not a tsunami. Michael had mentioned Julia before, a quiet, artistic girl he'd met at a gallery opening. Carol had pictured someone ethereal, perhaps a little bohemian. Certainly not the kind of woman who would engage in a power struggle over holiday dinners. She'd imagined long, philosophical conversations, shared trips to art museums, a bond forged over mutual respect, and a shared love for Michael. This was it, she'd thought. Her chance to rewrite history, to prove that a mother-in-law could be a friend, a confidant, a second mother without the suffocating grip of Eleanor's generation. She'd met Julia a week later over brunch at a trendy spa in Lincoln Park. Julia was indeed pretty, with wide, expressive eyes and a cascade of dark hair that framed a delicate face. She was slender, almost fragile, and spoke in soft, measured tones. Carol had found her polite, perhaps a little shy, but she'd attributed that to nerves. After all, meeting your future mother-in-law was no small feat. Carol had gone out of her way to make Julia feel comfortable, asking about her art, her dreams, her family. Julia had offered brief, almost evasive answers, but Carol had dismissed it as modesty. She'd seen a kindred spirit, a young woman who, like herself, valued grace and quiet strength. This was going to be easy, she'd convinced herself. This was going to be different. The wedding, a small, intimate affair in early 2020, had been lovely. Carol had worn a tasteful navy dress, a stark contrast to Eleanor's flamboyant fuchsia at her own wedding. She'd beamed as Michael and Julia exchanged vows, tears pricking her eyes, not of sadness, but of pure, unadulterated joy. Her son was happy, and she, Carol, was going to be the best mother-in-law a girl could ask for. She'd already started envisioning their future, family vacations, Sunday dinners, the gentle rhythm of shared lives. She'd even started a mental list of recipes Julia might enjoy, recipes that had been passed down through generations of Carol's family, recipes that symbolized warmth, tradition, and unconditional love. After the wedding, Michael and Julia had moved into a charming, if slightly cramped, apartment in a bustling neighborhood on the north side. Carol had deliberately not offered them a room in her spacious three-bedroom house, a conscious decision to give them space, to allow them to build their own life, free from the shadow of parental oversight. She remembered Eleanor's constant intrusions, her unannounced visits, her critical assessments of Carol's housekeeping skills. No, Carol would be different. She would respect their boundaries, offer support when asked, and be a loving presence, not an overbearing one. She'd invited them over for dinner regularly, always making Julia's favorite dishes, always ensuring she felt cherished and included. Julia, however, remained somewhat reserved. She'd accept Carol's compliments with a small smile, her eyes flickering away almost immediately. She'd contribute little to conversations, often deferring to Michael. Carol had initially interpreted this as shyness, a natural reticence in a new family dynamic. She told herself that Julia would open up in time, that she just needed to feel secure, to understand that Carol's affection was genuine, not a prelude to judgment. After all, Carol was a stranger to Julia, a new figure in her life, and building trust took time. She was patient. She was understanding. She was everything Eleanor wasn't. Then, the world had changed. The pandemic, a silent, insidious force, had swept across the globe, bringing with it uncertainty, fear, and economic upheaval. Michael, a promising young architect, had been one of the first casualties of the economic downturn. His firm, like so many others, had downsized, and he'd found himself suddenly unemployed. He'd quickly found another position, a temporary gig with a smaller firm, but the pay cut was significant. To compound their woes, their landlord, a man Carol privately suspected of having the moral compass of a broken clock, had seized the opportunity to hike their rent, setting market adjustments in a time when the market was in freefall. One evening, Michael had called, his voice tight with stress. "Mom," he'd begun, and Carol had immediately sensed the shift in his tone. "Julia and we were wondering if we could stay with you for a bit, just until things stabilize." Carol hadn't hesitated. "Of course, darling. My home is your home." "You know that?" She'd felt a surge of maternal protectiveness, a fierce desire to shield her son and his wife from the harsh realities of the world. Besides, she thought this was another opportunity. A chance to truly bond with Julia, to show her the depth of Carol's love and support. They would navigate this crisis together, a united front. She'd even started planning a schedule, a way to ensure everyone felt comfortable and respected in her home. She'd give them the larger guest room, the one with the bay window and the view of the park. She'd move into the smaller one, the one she used as a study. It was a small sacrifice, she'd reasoned, for the sake of family, a small sacrifice for the sake of proving Eleanor wrong. She had no idea that this seemingly innocuous decision would be the first domino to fall, setting in motion a chain of events that would unravel the very fabric of her carefully constructed world, exposing secrets and betrayals that would leave her questioning everything she thought she knew about love, family, and herself. The echo, she would soon learn, was not just in the hallway, but deep within her own soul, waiting to be awakened by the very person she had welcomed into her family with open arms. The stage was set for a drama far more intricate and devastating than any she could have imagined. A drama that would force her to confront not just Julia, but the unresolved specters of her own past, and the chilling realization that sometimes, the harder you run from history, the faster it catches up to you. The illusion of control, of a perfect family, was about to shatter, revealing the raw, uncomfortable truths that lay beneath the surface of their seemingly idyllic lives. And Carol, the woman who had vowed to be different, would find herself standing at the precipice of becoming the very thing she feared most, her mother-in-law. The first few days were a blur of activity. Michael and Julia moved their belongings in, a collection of boxes that seemed to multiply with each trip from the U-Haul. Carol, ever the gracious hostess, directed the movers, offered refreshments, and tried to create an atmosphere of cheerful chaos. She'd made a pot of her famous chili, a comforting, hearty meal that she hoped would signal a warm welcome. But as the initial flurry of unpacking subsided, a strange quiet settled over the house. It wasn't the peaceful silence of a contented home, but the heavy, expectant silence of a theater before the curtain rises on a tragedy. Julia, who had been a whirlwind of motion during the move, now seemed to retreat into herself. She'd spent hours in her room, the door always slightly ajar, a silent barrier that Carol was hesitant to cross. When she did emerge, it was with a skittish, almost furtive air, as if she were a guest in a stranger's house, not a cherished member of the family. She'd drift into the kitchen, her movements small and contained, and prepare a small meal for herself, leaving a trail of crumbs on the counter and a single dirty dish in the sink. Carol, at first, would clean up after her, a silent act of service that she hoped would convey her affection. But as the days turned into weeks, the crumbs and the dirty dishes began to feel less like an oversight and more like a statement. Carol tried to engage her. "Julia, dear, I was thinking of making lasagna tonight. Is that something you'd like?" "I'm not very hungry," Julia would murmur, her eyes fixed on her phone. "Oh, well, I can make something else." "What are you in the mood for?" "It doesn't matter. I'll just grab something later." And later, Carol would find the remnants of a hastily assembled sandwich on the kitchen counter, a smear of mustard on the pristine white marble, a bread knife left precariously on the edge. It was a small thing, a trivial thing, but it was a constant, grating reminder of the invisible wall that Julia had erected between them. Carol, who had prided herself on her immaculate home, found herself constantly tidying up, a silent, resentful maid in her own house. She tried to talk to Michael about it, gently at first. "Honey, Julia seems a little distant. Is everything all right?" Michael, ever the peacemaker, would brush it off. "She's just adjusting, Mom. It's a big change for her." But as the weeks wore on, even Michael's optimism began to wane. He'd come home from his new, less fulfilling job, his shoulders slumped with the weight of his diminished ambitions, only to be met with a tense, silent dinner. He'd try to draw Julia out to coax a smile from her, but she'd offer only monosyllabic answers, her gaze drifting to the window, to her phone, anywhere but at him or Carol. Carol, meanwhile, was starting to feel a familiar, unwelcome emotion bubbling up inside her, resentment. It was the same resentment she'd felt all those years ago, living under Eleanor's roof, a constant, low-grade hum of frustration that had threatened to consume her. She'd sworn she would never be that person, the nagging, critical mother-in-law. But as she wiped away another smear of mustard, as she washed another dirty dish, she could feel the ghost of Eleanor whispering in her ear. One evening, after a particularly trying day, Carol decided she'd had enough. She found Michael in the living room, staring blankly at the television. "Michael, we need to talk." He muted the TV, his expression wary. "What's up, Mom?" "It's about Julia," Carol began, her voice trembling slightly. I can't keep doing this. I feel like a stranger in my own home. She doesn't talk to me, she doesn't help out, she treats me like I'm the hired help." Michael sighed, a long, weary sound. "I know, Mom. I've tried talking to her. She says she feels like she's walking on eggshells, that she's afraid of doing something wrong." "Doing something wrong?" Carol's voice rose, a note of hysteria creeping in. "I haven't said a word to her. I've been nothing but accommodating." "I know, Mom, but you have to understand. You're a lot. You're very put together. Your house is perfect. Your meals are perfect. It's intimidating." Carol stared at him, dumbfounded. "So I'm being punished for being a good homemaker? For trying to make a nice home for all of us? No, of course not. It's just, maybe you could relax a little? Let things be a little messy? Maybe if she doesn't feel like she has to live up to your standards, she'll be more comfortable." Carol wanted to scream. She wanted to tell him about the years she'd spent living up to Eleanor's impossible standards, the constant fear of being found wanting. But she bit her tongue. She had promised herself she would be different. So, she took a deep breath and nodded. "All right, Michael. I'll try." And she did. She left the dishes in the sink overnight. She let the dust bunnies gather in the corners. She stopped planning elaborate meals and resorted to simple, one-pot dinners. The house, once a source of pride, now felt chaotic and unkempt. And Julia? Julia didn't seem to notice. She continued to drift through the house like a ghost, leaving her messes in her wake. Her silence a constant, deafening roar. Then came the morning that changed everything. Carol was in the kitchen, staring at the overflowing trash can, a symbol of her failed experiment in relaxing, when Julia appeared in the doorway. She was pale, her eyes wide and luminous in her drawn face. She was clutching a small, white stick in her hand. "I'm pregnant," she whispered, and the words hung in the air, heavy and portentous. For a moment, Carol's resentment vanished, replaced by a surge of pure, unadulterated joy. A baby. A grandchild. This was it, the thing that would finally bring them together, the thing that would heal the fractures in their fragile family. She rushed forward, her arms outstretched. "Oh, Julia, that's wonderful news." But Julia flinched, taking a step back. "No," she said, her voice flat. "It's not." Carol's arms dropped to her sides. "What do you... It's not. A baby is a blessing." "I'm not having it," Julia said, and the words were like a slap in the face. "I'm gonna have an abortion." Carol stared at her, her mind reeling. An abortion? The word itself was anathema to her, a violation of everything she held sacred. She was a devout Catholic, a woman who believed that life began at conception, that a baby was a gift from God. "You can't be serious," she stammered. "I am," Julia said, her chin jutting out in a rare display of defiance. "It's my body, my choice." But Michael, does he know? What does he think? "He'll support me," Julia said, though her voice wavered slightly. "He understands that we're not in a position to have a baby right now. He just lost his job. We're living in your house. It's not the right time." "There's never a right time," Carol cried, her voice rising. "A baby is a gift, not a financial burden. I'll help you. I'll support you. We'll make it work." "I don't want to make it work," Julia said, her voice cold. "I don't want to be a mother." And with that, she turned and walked away, leaving Carol standing in the messy kitchen, her heart pounding, her world tilting on its axis. The battle lines had been drawn. This was no longer about dirty dishes and unspoken resentments. This was about life and death. This was about a soul. And Carol, who had once dreamed of being a supportive, understanding mother-in-law, now found herself cast in a role she had never wanted, the fierce, unyielding protector of her unborn grandchild. It's strange how these dark family secrets connect us. If this story is getting under your skin, subscribe for more real family exposés. The days that followed were a living nightmare. The house, once a haven, became a battleground. Every conversation was a minefield, every glance a potential spark that could ignite a full-blown war. Carol tried to reason with Julia, to appeal to her sense of morality, to her maternal instincts. She'd leave pamphlets from the local crisis pregnancy center on the kitchen counter, articles about the beauty of motherhood on the coffee table. She'd talk endlessly about the joys of raising Michael, about the first time he'd smiled, the first time he'd said mama. Julia, in turn, retreated even further into herself. She'd listened to Carol's pleas with a blank, unreadable expression, her eyes like two dark, empty pools. She'd stopped eating with them altogether, surviving on a diet of toast and tea, her already slender frame growing more and more gaunt. She'd spent hours on the phone, her voice a low, urgent murmur, and Carol knew with a sickening certainty that she was making arrangements. Michael was caught in the crossfire, a soldier trapped in a no-man's land of his own making. He tried to mediate, to find some common ground, but there was none to be found. "Mom, you have to back off," he'd plead with Carol. "You're only making things worse. I'm trying to save my grandchild," she'd retort, her voice raw with emotion. Then he'd go to Julia, his voice gentle, persuasive. "Julia, honey, maybe we should just talk about it. Maybe we could look at adoption. There are so many families who would love to have a baby." "I'm not a vessel, Michael," she'd snap, her voice sharp as a shard of glass. "I'm not going through 9 months of pregnancy just to give the baby away." The arguments grew more frequent, more intense. The house, once filled with the promise of a new beginning, now echoed with the sounds of slammed doors and angry whispers. Carol, who had always been so careful to maintain a calm, serene demeanor, found herself consumed by a righteous fury. She was no longer the gentle, accommodating mother-in-law. She was a warrior, a crusader, fighting for the life of an innocent child. One evening, the tension finally reached its breaking point. Carol had just returned from a meeting of her church's pro-life committee, her heart heavy with a sense of impending doom. She found Julia in the kitchen, her back to the door, talking on the phone. "Tomorrow at 10, Julia was saying, her voice low and conspiratorial. "No, he won't be there. He has that meeting in the city. It's better this way." Carol's blood ran cold. Tomorrow. It was happening tomorrow. She stepped into the kitchen, her presence a silent accusation. Julia's eyes widened in alarm, and she quickly ended the call. "I was just talking to my sister," she said, her voice a little too bright, a little too casual. "Don't lie to me," Carol said, her voice dangerously quiet. "I know what you're doing. You don't know anything," Julia shot back, her fear giving way to a flash of anger. "I know that you're planning to kill my grandchild," Carol said, and the words once spoken hung in the air, ugly and irrevocable. "It's not a grandchild," Julia hissed. "It's a clump of cells. And it's my clump of cells to do with as I please. How can you be so callous?" Carol cried, her voice breaking. "How can you be so heartless?" "Heartless?" Julia's laugh was a harsh, brittle sound. "You want to talk about heartless? You, with your perfect life, your perfect house, your perfect son. You have no idea what it's like to be trapped, to have no choices, to have your future decided for you by someone else." "I'm not trying to decide your future," Carol insisted. "I'm trying to give you a future with a beautiful baby, a family, love. Love." Julia's voice dripped with sarcasm. "You call this love? This suffocating, controlling, judgmental. This is what you call love? I am not judgmental." Carol's voice rose to a shout. "I am trying to help you. You're not helping me." Julia shouted back, her face contorted with a rage that Carol had never seen before. "You're trying to control me, just like she controlled you." Carol froze. "What did you say?" Julia's eyes widened, a flicker of fear replacing the anger. She seemed to realize she'd gone too far, that she'd crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. "Nothing," she mumbled, turning to leave. But Carol was faster. She grabbed Julia's arm, her grip surprisingly strong. "What did you mean by that?" "Just like she controlled you. Who are you talking about?" Julia tried to pull away, but Carol held her fast. "Tell me," she demanded, her voice low and menacing. Julia's face crumpled and tears began to stream down her cheeks. I shouldn't have said anything. Michael made me promise." "Michael?" Carol's heart began to pound, a slow, heavy drumbeat of dread. "What does Michael have to do with this?" "He told me," Julia sobbed, her voice muffled by her hands. He told me about your mother-in-law. About what she made you do? Carol stared at her, her mind a blank, a canvas wiped clean of all thought, all emotion. Her mother-in-law. Eleanor. The name, once a source of irritation, now felt like a physical blow. What she made you do? The words echoed in the silent kitchen, a ghostly whisper from a past that Carol had buried so deep. She'd almost convinced herself it had never happened. I don't know what you're talking about, she said, her voice a hoarse whisper. But Julia was no longer listening. She was lost in her own world of grief and anger, her sobs the only sound in the suddenly cavernous room. He told me everything, she choked out. About the baby. The one you lost. The one she forced you to get rid of. The secret, the one Carol had carried in the dark, silent corners of her heart for over 30 years, was out. And in the harsh, unforgiving light of the kitchen, it looked even uglier than she remembered. The abortion. The one she'd been forced to have. A young, scared girl, trapped in a loveless marriage, at the mercy of a woman who had seen her as nothing more than an incubator for the family name. The secret that had shaped her, that had defined her, that had driven her to be the perfect mother, the perfect wife, the perfect mother-in-law. The secret that was now, in a cruel twist of fate, being used as a weapon against her by the very person she had tried so desperately to love. The floor seemed to tilt beneath her feet. The carefully constructed walls of her life, the ones she had built brick by brick, year by year, were crumbling around her. And in the rubble, she saw not the righteous, loving matriarch she had always imagined herself to be, but a woman she didn't recognize, a woman consumed by a grief so old, so profound, it had become a part of her very soul. The echo, she finally understood, was not just in the hallway, not just in the past. It was in her. It was her. The revelation hung in the air, thick and suffocating. A ghost from Carol's past materialized in her pristine kitchen. Julia, still sobbing, pulled free from Carol's grasp and fled to her room, leaving Carol alone amidst the wreckage of her carefully constructed reality. The silence that followed was not empty, but filled with the cacophony of 30 years of suppressed memories, now screaming for attention. The perfect life, the perfect mother, the perfect home, all of it felt like a fragile facade, shattered by a single, carelessly flung truth. Carol stumbled to a chair, her legs suddenly too weak to hold her. The image of a younger Carol, barely out of her teens, sitting in a sterile doctor's office, Eleanor's cold hand on her arm flashed before her eyes. The hushed tones, the clinical detachment, the overwhelming sense of shame and powerlessness. It had been a different era, a different world, but the pain was as fresh as if it had happened yesterday. Eleanor, ever the pragmatist, had deemed it a necessary evil, a way to protect the family name, to ensure Michael's father, her son, could pursue his burgeoning career without the burden of an unplanned child. Carol had been too young, too naive, too terrified to resist. She had buried the memory so deep, convinced herself it was for the best, that it was a sacrifice she had made for her husband, for her future. But now, seeing Julia's defiant, desperate face, Carol realized the true cost of that buried secret. She spent the rest of the evening in a daze, the house silent save for the occasional muffled sob from Julia's room. Michael returned home, oblivious to the emotional earthquake that had just rocked their home. He walked into the kitchen, a tired smile on his face, and stopped short when he saw Carol, pale and trembling, staring blankly at the wall. "Mom? What's wrong? Where's Julia?" Carol couldn't speak. The words were lodged in her throat, a bitter, metallic taste. She simply pointed vaguely towards Julia's room. Michael, sensing the gravity of the situation, rushed to his wife, leaving Carol alone once more with her ghosts. Later, much later, Michael emerged from the room, his face a mask of confusion and anger. He found Carol still in the kitchen, nursing a cup of cold tea. "Mom? What did you say to her? She's hysterical." Carol finally found her voice, though it was thin and reedy. She told me about Eleanor, about the baby. Michael's eyes widened in alarm. She told you? How could she? I told her that was our secret. Our secret? Carol's voice rose, a tremor of fury running through it. You knew? All this time, you knew? And you never told me? Michael ran a hand through his hair, looking utterly defeated. It wasn't my place, Mom. Dad told me when I was a teenager, after you two had that big fight about something else. He said it was a secret, a family tragedy, and that you'd never recovered. He made me promise not to tell you, not to bring it up. He thought it would hurt you too much. Hurt me? Carol laughed, a harsh, humorless sound. It's been hurting me my entire life, Michael. Every decision I've made, every fear I've harbored, every impossible standard I've set for myself, it all stems from that. From the shame, from the guilt, from the feeling that I was somehow tainted. I'm so sorry, Mom, Michael said, his voice thick with regret. I thought I was protecting you. You were protecting him, Carol retorted, her voice laced with bitterness. Protecting his memory, his reputation, not me. This revelation that her own son had carried the secret, that her late husband had burdened him with it, added another layer of betrayal to the already complex tapestry of her pain. It wasn't just Eleanor's ghost haunting her, but the ghost of a marriage built on a foundation of silence and unspoken trauma. She had spent her life trying to be the antithesis of Eleanor, only to realize that the very trauma Eleanor inflicted had shaped her into a different kind of controlling figure. One who, in her desperate attempt to avoid past mistakes, was now repeating them in a new, equally destructive way. Over the next few days, the house became a tomb. Julia remained barricaded in her room, emerging only for quick, furtive trips to the bathroom. Michael tried to bridge the chasm moving between his mother and his wife, a weary messenger in a war he couldn't win. Carol, meanwhile, replayed every interaction with Julia, every subtle criticism, every well-intentioned piece of advice, through the lens of her own past. She saw now how her fear of history repeating itself had manifested as a desperate need for control, a need to steer Julia away from a path she herself had been forced down. Her desire to be a supportive mother-in-law had curdled into something suffocating, something that mirrored Eleanor's own manipulative tactics. The irony was a cruel twist of the knife. She had become Eleanor, not in her outward demeanor, but in her underlying motivations, in her desperate, misguided attempts to dictate another woman's choices. The realization was a bitter pill to swallow, a profound blow to her self-image. She had believed herself to be a beacon of progress, a breaker of cycles, but she was merely a different link in the same chain of intergenerational trauma. Julia's appointment loomed, a dark cloud on the horizon. Carol felt a desperate urgency, a need to somehow undo the damage, to reach Julia before it was too late. But every attempt to communicate was met with a slammed door, a curt dismissal, or a fresh wave of tears. Michael, too, was at his wit's end. He'd tried everything, pleading, reasoning, even threatening. But Julia was unyielding, her resolve hardened by her own fear and the perceived betrayal of her husband's family. One afternoon, Carol overheard Michael on the phone, his voice low and strained. I don't know what else to do, Dad. She's not listening to anyone. Mom's a mess, and Julia's just shutting down. Carol realized he was talking to his father, her ex-husband, the man who'd been complicit in her own past trauma. A fresh wave of anger, cold and sharp, washed over her. How dare he offer advice now, after all these years of silence? How dare he pretend to care about the fallout from a secret he had helped bury? This new layer of betrayal, the realization that her ex-husband had not only kept the secret, but had also discussed it with their son, further fractured Carol's sense of reality. It wasn't just Eleanor's legacy, but a patriarchal conspiracy of silence that had shaped her life. The weight of it all was crushing, a suffocating blanket of unspoken truths and unresolved pain. She felt utterly alone, adrift in a sea of family secrets, with no compass to guide her. The morning of Julia's appointment dawned gray and unforgiving, mirroring the turmoil in Carol's soul. She had barely slept, her mind a relentless carousel of past regrets and present anxieties. The revelation of her own forced abortion, a secret she had meticulously buried for decades, had ripped open old wounds, exposing a raw, festering pain she thought she had long since healed. Now, every interaction with Julia, every silent accusation, every defiant glance, was magnified through the lens of her own trauma. She saw not a stubborn, ungrateful daughter-in-law, but a reflection of her younger self, scared, vulnerable, and desperate for control over her own body and destiny. Michael, too, was a wreck. He had spent the night on the couch, unable to face either his mother's silent condemnation or his wife's stony resolve. He was caught in an impossible bind, torn between the two women he loved, both demanding an allegiance he couldn't fully give. He had tried to talk to Julia again, to plead with her, to offer alternatives, but she had shut him down, her voice cold and resolute. "It's happening, Michael. And if you're not with me, then you're against me." Carol watched him from the kitchen, a silent observer of his agony. She saw the lines of stress etched around his eyes, the slump of his shoulders, the way he ran a hand through his hair. A gesture so reminiscent of his father. And in that moment, a new wave of understanding, sharp and painful, washed over her. Her husband, Michael's father, had been a good man, but he had also been a product of his time, a man who had prioritized appearances and societal expectations over the emotional well-being of his young wife. He had believed he was protecting her, protecting their family, by silencing her pain, by burying the truth. But in doing so, he had inadvertently set in motion a chain of events that had reverberated through generations, culminating in this very moment. She realized then that her anger at Michael for keeping the secret was misplaced. He was merely repeating a pattern, a learned behavior passed down from his father. The true villain, if there was one, was the insidious culture of silence, the societal pressure that forced women to make impossible choices and then bear the burden of those choices in isolation. Eleanor had been a victim of it, Carol had been a victim of it, and now, in a different guise, Julia was a victim of it too. As the clock ticked closer to Julia's appointment, a desperate urgency seized Carol. She couldn't let history repeat itself, not like this. Not with Julia, not with her grandchild. But how could she reach her? How could she break through the wall of anger and resentment that had built up between them? She had tried everything, logic, emotion, even veiled threats. Nothing had worked. Then a thought cold and clear pierced through the fog of her despair. She had to tell Julia everything. Not just about Eleanor, but about her own experience, her own pain, her own regret. It was a terrifying prospect, exposing her deepest, most vulnerable wound to the very person who had inadvertently reopened it. But she knew with a certainty that transcended fear that it was the only way. It was the only way to truly connect with Julia, to show her that she understood, not just intellectually, but from the depths of her own scarred soul. She found Julia in her room, dressed and ready to leave, her face pale but determined. Michael was sitting on the edge of the bed, his head in his hands. The air was thick with unspoken tension, a palpable sense of impending doom. Carol took a deep breath, her heart hammering against her ribs, and stepped into the room. "Julia," she began, her voice surprisingly steady. "We need to talk. Just you and me." Julia looked up, her eyes narrowed with suspicion. "There's nothing to talk about, Carol. My decision is made." "Please," Carol pleaded, her voice cracking slightly. "Just 5 minutes. Please." Michael looked up, his eyes meeting Carol's. He saw the raw vulnerability there, the desperate plea for understanding. He nodded almost imperceptibly, a silent acknowledgement of the gravity of the moment. He stood up and left the room, closing the door softly behind him, leaving the two women alone in the quiet tension. Carol sat on the edge of the bed, facing Julia. She took another deep breath, gathering her courage. "Julia," she began again, her voice softer now, more intimate. "What Michael told you about Eleanor, it's true. She forced me to have an abortion years ago, before Michael was born." Julia stared at her, her expression unreadable. The defiance in her eyes softened, replaced by a flicker of surprise, then a dawning comprehension. She had expected anger, condemnation, another lecture. She had not expected this raw, painful confession. Carol continued, the words tumbling out now, a torrent of long-suppressed pain. She spoke of her youth, her naivete, her fear. She spoke of Eleanor's relentless pressure, her subtle manipulations, her unwavering conviction that she knew best. She spoke of the shame, the guilt, the profound sense of loss that had haunted her for decades. She spoke of the baby she had never known, the life that had been denied, the choices that had been taken away from her. As she spoke, Carol felt a strange sense of liberation, a shedding of a heavy burden she had carried for far too long. She saw Julia's expression shift, from suspicion to empathy, from anger to understanding. Tears welled up in Julia's eyes, not of self-pity but of a shared pain, a recognition of a common wound. "I spent my entire life trying to be different from Eleanor," Carol confessed, her voice thick with emotion. "Trying to be the supportive mother-in-law, the one who would never interfere, never judge. But in my desperation to avoid her mistakes, I made my own. I tried to control you, Julia. I tried to force you into a choice that I believed was right, not because it was right for you, but because it was the choice I wished I had made. I was so afraid of you making the same mistake I did that I became the very thing I despised." Julia reached out, her hand trembling, and gently touched Carol's arm. I didn't know," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "Michael only told me that she made you get rid of a baby. He didn't tell me it was your baby." "It was," Carol said, a single tear tracing a path down her cheek. "And the pain never truly goes away. It just changes. It becomes a part of you. And I didn't want that for you, Julia. I didn't want you to carry that burden. But you were trying to force me to have a baby I don't want," Julia said, her voice still soft, but with a hint of her old defiance. "Isn't that the same thing? Isn't that taking away my choice?" Carol nodded, her gaze steady. "Yes," she admitted, her voice barely a whisper. "Yes, it is. And for that, Julia, I am so sorry. I was so caught up in my own past, in my own pain, that I couldn't see yours. I projected my fears onto you, and I tried to control your life, just as Eleanor tried to control mine. I became the very thing I swore I would never be." This was the game-changing revelation, not just for Julia, but for Carol herself. The realization that her own trauma had been driving her actions, that her attempts to help were actually a manifestation of her own unresolved pain, was a profound and shattering moment. It recontextualized everything: her strained relationship with Julia, her constant need for control, her unwavering belief in her own righteousness. She saw now that her fight for the unborn child was not purely altruistic. It was a desperate attempt to rewrite her own history, to atone for a past she had never truly forgiven herself for. The emotional peak scene unfolded in the quiet intimacy of Julia's room. The raw honesty, the shared vulnerability, the sudden, unexpected connection between two women who had been at war. It was a moment of profound catharsis, a breaking down of barriers that had seemed insurmountable. The cinematic tension was not in a physical confrontation, but in the agonizing emotional truth that was finally being laid bare. A truth that had the power to either destroy them or to forge a new, stronger bond. Julia looked at Carol, her eyes filled with a mixture of tears and a newfound understanding. "So, what do we do now?" she asked, her voice small. Carol reached out and took Julia's hand, her grip firm and reassuring. "No," she said, her voice imbued with the quiet strength. "Now we talk. We talk about your choices, your fears, your future. Not mine. Not Eleanor's. Yours." This was Carol's character transformation moment. She had shed the mantle of the judgmental matriarch, the self-righteous protector, and emerged as something far more profound. A woman who had finally confronted her own demons, who had found the courage to be vulnerable, to admit her mistakes, and to offer genuine empathy instead of unsolicited advice. She was no longer trying to be different from Eleanor. She was simply trying to be herself, a flawed, complex human being capable of both great love and great error. This moment shattered everything I knew. If you're feeling the shock too, it helps uncover more hidden family truths. The conversation that followed was long and arduous, punctuated by tears and raw confessions. Julia, for the first time, spoke openly about her fears, the instability of Michael's job, the precariousness of their living situation, her own artistic ambitions that felt increasingly out of reach. She confessed to feeling overwhelmed, trapped, and utterly alone in her decision. Carol listened, truly listened, without interruption, without judgment, a skill she realized she had rarely employed with Julia before. She saw not a defiant daughter-in-law, but a young woman grappling with immense pressure, a woman who, like herself, was trying to navigate a world that often felt rigged against her. Carol, in turn, shared more details of her own past, the years of silent shame, the constant fear of judgment, the way it had colored every aspect of her life. She spoke of her marriage, of the unspoken tensions that had simmered beneath the surface, of the love that had been both a comfort and a cage. She spoke of her own ambitions, the dreams she had sacrificed for the sake of her family, the resentment that had festered in the dark corners of her heart. This moment, this shared vulnerability, was the true climax. It wasn't a grand explosion of drama, but a quiet implosion of defenses, a shattering of illusions that had kept them apart. Carol's transformation was complete. She had moved from a place of judgment and control to one of empathy and understanding. She had faced her own past, not as a victim but as a survivor, and in doing so, had found a way to connect with Julia on a deeply human level. The future was still uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, there was hope. Hope for healing, hope for connection, hope for a family that could finally confront its truths, however painful they might be. I still lie awake wondering, what would you have done when they tried to control your body? Share your truth in the comments. Subscribe for more shocking family revelations.